Welcome to another episode of Complementary Health, and I have here with me today Tim Durgans, who is a longtime resident of Pleasantville. He happens to be my neighbor as well. And Tim did a very interesting journey, which he's here to discuss with us. He did what is called the Camino de Santiago. And so, Tim, I wanted to talk a little bit with you about, number one, what inspired you, and what gave you the reason, the purpose to do something like this.
Sure. So a few years ago, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was watching a movie called The Way. Some people may have seen it. It's got Martin Sheen in it. The movie was done by Emilio Estevez, his actual son. Mm-hmm. And it was I found the movie incredibly inspiring and moving, and it's of course about the Camino de Santiago. And while I was watching it, I was thinking to myself, I'll never be able to do that. I'm working.
When do you have time?
I'll never ever be able to do that. I work many, many hours. I'm riding the train to Metro North, and it's not something that's ever going to happen. So I kind of filed that one away with something I'm not going to be able to do and fit into my lifestyle. And then a couple of years ago, after making a lifestyle change and leaving my job in the city, the movie came on a second time, and I was watching it. And again, in my mind, I went back to the files and was remembering what I thought previously, and I went right back to, I can't do that, I'll never be able to do that. And of course, then the light bulb went off. Of course I could do this, as soon as I get permission from my wife. So I have to get permission. So, and then it was I went into a planning stage where I started trying to figure out, how am I gonna do this? How do I get ready? I don't know anything about doing this.
So did you read about, kind of how to prepare and what to expect?
Sure.
I mean, what were some of the things that you had to look into?
Yeah, so of course thank God for Google, so I went on Google and found some different websites and forums where people who've done the trip before, read books. There's a great book by John Brierley that a lot of people use when they're walking the Camino. It's got maps and advice and stuff like that, so I was using that book. But the forums were really good because, of course, never having done a journey like this before, and I'm not a big camping kind of person, so I didn't have a backpack.
Really, Tim?
No, that's not really my thing. So I didn't have any of that sort of equipment, so I didn't even know what to buy. So I had to go out and try to figure out, what is the stuff that I'm going to need for this trip, and how do I not overpack? And I'm an over planner on things, so I really went down the rabbit hole with these websites and keeping notes. All of which was my wife didn't know anything about this at the time, so I was keeping it all kind of down the down low.
So, in terms of physically preparing for this, what were you, did you hike? What were you doing?
Sure. So, I'm not in the world's greatest shape like many others. I don't exercise as much as I should. So I knew it was a long trip and it was going to be, tiring and difficult and so forth. So I went over to Rockefeller State Park and started hiking with my pack and my hiking poles, which was, people walking through Rockefeller thought I was a little crazy. What's this guy? There's no camping here. Why is he walking with a pack? But I was trying to get used to carrying the weight on my back.
Right. And you had hurt your, was it your leg or your ankle a while ago?
Yeah, I had ankle surgery a couple years ago, and I've got bad Achilles. So again, I had to prepare myself.
Yeah.
I was a little worried. I was a little concerned.
Yeah.
So I just, I had to get prepared at Rockefeller. At the time I thought I was well prepared, but looking back at it, the preparation just wasn't enough. I was hiking maybe 2 or 3 hours at Rockefeller, which does not prepare you for an 8 or 12 hour hike in heat.
So you had basically one backpack.
I did have one pack. Well, that's not entirely true.
No?
I had one regular pack, and then I had a very small day pack that I carried with me for when I had to go to the supermarket or something like that. I could take a small pack with me.
And minimal amount of food. Talk to me a little bit about you knew you were going to be staying in certain places, right? And they do feed you. There's a certain.
So sometimes they feed you and some days they don't. So the Camino is not the Appalachian Trail. You don't have to stash food along the trail. You're going to be stopping in either small villages all the way up to large cities, and you can get food pretty much anywhere. You can go to a supermarket and then make your own food. You can, sometimes the albergue, which is the hostel that you stay at, sometimes they offer a meal that it's an option that you can add on.
Right.
You can go out to a restaurant, but all of those are on a sliding scale. I mean, some are more expensive than others. Some people are on a tighter budget than others. So it's just a matter of, what kind of experience you want to have while you're on the Camino.
Well, I mean, I know you had mentioned that before that there are certain places that you could stay, and there's different levels that you can stay at, because I can imagine that, like you said, with the costs,
Right.
So describe, for example, one of the places you stayed at that
Sure.
was.
So yeah, that's exactly right. It's like any sort of level of place you could imagine. You could stay anywhere from a 5-star hotel to a donativo, which is a place to stay by donation. So those are usually college students like to stay there because they're about 5 to 10 euros to stay. Very cheap, very Spartan. So I stayed at pretty much every different kind of place with the exception of 5-star. I didn't do 5-star.
Didn't you stay at one?
I did stay at hotels a
Yeah.
couple times,
Okay.
and the way it would go is, you'd go to a town, and sometimes you could book ahead using an app. You could schedule ahead where you were going to stay.
Oh, good.
Sometimes you would just walk into town and then go look for a place to stay. And a lot of people, there's a little bit of kind of a daring do when you have that kind of a situation where you're like, oh, I'm just going to go find a place to stay, and it adds a little bit of excitement, I think, to the trip. The challenge is if you get to a town late in the afternoon
and they're booked,
they're booked, you have to keep walking.
Oh, wow.
If there's nowhere to stay, there's nowhere to stay.
There's nowhere
you
to
have
stay.
Keep walking.
And were there like some of these towns were tiny,
Some of the
right?
towns were very tiny. So the middle part of Spain, where the Camino Frances goes through, it's very empty. So there's a lot of very small towns that are basically hanging on with pilgrim traffic to support them. So you see a lot of like older people, almost no kids. You see very few kids, and they make Pleasantville look like a metropolis. I mean, we're talking about some of the towns had 20 or 50 people, maybe.
Wow.
So very super small, and it's just it's a very interesting kind of experience to walk through a town like that.
So there are several different choices
Sure.
of paths that you can take.
Yes.
So you did
I did the Camino Frances.
Okay.
Which starts in Saint Jean Pied de Port, which is in the northwest part of Spain. It's near Bayonne, if anybody knows that part of France. And you walk west, so you're in France for maybe not even half a day, like 4 or 5 hours.
Oh, okay.
And then you cross into the Pyrenees, and then you're in Spain, and then you just keep walking west until you get to Santiago.
So is every one of those choices the same number of kilometers?
No.
Okay.
So
explain what that is.
So the Camino de Santiago is an ancient religious pilgrimage. So people were coming from all over Europe at that time, and over the past, since the Middle Ages, people have been doing this. So people came from wherever they lived. So some people were coming from Western France.
Right.
Some people were coming from other parts of Portugal. Some people were walking along the coast of northern Spain, which is called the Camino del Norte. The Portugal one is the Camino Portugués. So there's lots of different places you can walk from. You can walk from Le Puy in France.
Yeah.
Some people walk from Paris. And then
you
other
can
people
also walk from Vézelay, which is actually not far from.
That's true.
Yeah.
And some people just walk from their house. I met lots of Europeans who literally stepped out the front door of their house and just started walking west.
So why did you choose this particular?
Well, this is the one that was in the movie, so that was the one.
Okay.
That was the one that I knew the best.
Okay.
And it seemed among the more challenging ones. Le Puy going from Le Puy is really challenging. That's really far.
Really.
But I figured about 500 miles was a nice.
That was
and of course a lot.
Is that one of the longer ones?
It's one of the longer ones, and it really depends on how much time you have, also, because this is a big undertaking. It takes a little bit over a month to walk from St. John to Santiago. I think I walked 33 days with 1 day.
So why is this pilgrimage to Santiago? What is it about Santiago?
So Santiago is the resting place for St. James. St. James was buried there.
Because it's also called the Way of St. James.
Yeah, the Way of St. James. So again, the original idea was that it was a religious pilgrimage. I'm not particularly religious these days. But I found looked at it more from a spiritual enlightenment kind of thing.
Yeah.
But a lot of people do it for religious reasons. There's Mass almost every night in any town you're staying in.
Yeah.
So a lot of people will go to Mass. And again, in these very, very small towns, there'll be a Mass every night.
Right.
There's usually one at the beginning where the pilgrims are blessed, and then you get, if there's a pilgrim Mass, usually it's between 6 and 7 p.m. in the evening, and people will go have an early dinner and then go to Mass.
Yeah.
And then you got to go to bed early because you have to get up early.
So I was reading this article by Brian Cronin called "A Pilgrimage of the Soul: The Camino de Santiago," and he had this wonderful quote called "The Utility of Hardship." And he was with a friend when he did this trip, who described it to him as being the first third of the Camino drains you physically.
True, that is true.
The second third drains you mentally.
Definitely true.
And the final third, the only thing that gets you to Santiago is in your heart and your soul.
And your friends.
And your friends.
And your friends, yeah.
So it must be very difficult. And we talked about, the logistics of how you prepared and, all of that, which everybody can do and describe.
Sure.
But how do you describe what you went through? How do you describe that experience, that emotional piece that is so hard to do unless you're there doing it? I mean, that's the challenge.
It's incredibly difficult, and that's why I went looking for a way to describe it, and that's how I found that article. I actually found that article when I got home, and it's incredibly moving, the article, and I hope people can find it and read it. But even while we were walking, when I was walking with my friends, and by the way, these aren't friends that I had before I went to the trip, these are people I met when I was on the trip. We talked about how can you describe this to someone who hasn't seen something like this.
Right.
And I'm talking about, we were up every morning between, anywhere between 4 and 6 in the morning to start walking in the dark, watching the sun come up every morning, and this beautiful vistas that we were seeing, like mountainsides and the desert and everything, and really difficult to describe that kind of feeling to someone, or the feeling of you're in a cafe and someone you haven't seen in a couple of days has caught up with you, because the trip stretches out. People move ahead of you, people fall behind you, and you'll be sitting in a cafe. And I remember one day in particular where someone walked into town I hadn't seen in a couple of days, and the excitement of seeing that person, who you, by the way, you barely know, you've only known them for maybe 2 weeks, and you're so excited for them and happy for them, and you just can't explain that to someone unless you've actually done it, and you just can't describe that feeling. Or getting a coffee in the morning and like how grateful you are to have that coffee, or a sip of cold water when you're really parched. I mean, these kind of things are very simple, but like life is kind of like whittled down to its very basic on the Camino, and I think until you've done it, it's hard to explain it. The article does a good job, but it's still not the same.
It does, it really does. But tell me a little bit about the different types of people. I mean, what was the age span? Where were these people coming from? Like,
everywhere.
Everywhere.
They were from everywhere. So we actually made a game. A friend and I, we were walking and just making small talk, and we decided to make up a game. And the game was like the categories game of different things to talk about. Who was the youngest person you saw on the trip? Who was the oldest person you saw? Who had the most inspiring story? And the youngest, I think, was 6 years old.
Wow.
Which is quite young, being dragged along by his parents. And he was having fun, I guess. There was a 9-year-old girl who was having a good time. She was walking with her dad. And then the oldest person I think I met was 77. So it was a huge age range. And I kind of put them into a few different buckets. There were young people, like high school, college age, who have a lot of free time on their hands. So we met some high school students, a lot of college students, a lot of school teachers because they have the summer off. A lot of job and life changers, and then the rest were retirees. So that's why you saw this kind of broad assortment of people.
They all spoke English?
No, not all of them.
Some of them kind of muddled along, and you were able to.
I mean, I think people tend to gravitate to like language groups. It makes life a little bit easier. But we had, and sad to say, of course, the Americans are the worst and speak the fewest languages, which is really sad. But we ended up congregating in a group of people that spoke English, but that didn't mean they were from the U.S. Walk with people from all over the place, Puerto Rico, Denmark, Brazil, and in some of those cases, the folks didn't speak English at all. So I walked with a guy named Marcel for 3 days, and he didn't speak any English. And I speak a little bit of bad Spanish, and he doesn't speak Spanish. So we did a lot of hand signals to communicate. But it was very pleasant to walk with him, and then of course all the other people I met on the trip.
So I saw some photos that were so interesting. There were a lot of sayings and words of encouragement on bricks and stones. I mean,
the Camino poets.
The Camino poets. That's really lovely. I mean, was that something that just when you saw that, it just kind of gave you that feeling of, I'm going to keep on doing this, and I just want to make this happen? I mean,
the graffiti was, usually I'm not a big fan of graffiti because but I think in this case I really enjoyed it because the graffiti was really thoughtful. People left like these words of encouragement, like be real, and dance your own dance, sing your own song.
Right.
Funny. There were a lot of funny ones, and I think when you're really tired and you see some of these inspiring messages or funny messages. A funny one that we laughed about. It said "No vino, no Camino." Like obviously, that one's a funny one.
Yeah.
But the other ones were like, you can do this and things like that. So those kind of messages were really inspiring to keep people going.
Walking your own Camino.
So one of the sayings is you have to walk your own Camino. You're not doing someone else's Camino, you're doing your own.
And it's not a race.
It is not a race.
A competition.
It's not a race.
Right.
So, in some respects, some people, like myself included, were on a time schedule. I had to get to Santiago by a certain time. My wife was coming to meet me, and we were going to go on vacation. But other people had a little bit more time, and and either stretch the Camino or speed it up depending on what was needed. I needed to squeeze in a rest day, so I walked 3 really long days across the desert with 2 friends, and that was really hard.
Wow.
Because we walked over 30, I think we were walking 30 or 33 kilometers a day in the heat, and it was very hot. To get to a certain place so we could build in a rest day and still get to Santiago by the time we were aiming for it.
So were there any what must have been so interesting is the stories of people who might have wanted to share their stories.
Sure, yeah.
Some people might have been very reserved and just wanted to walk and not talk. I mean, was there any particular story that was inspirational to you?
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few. I mean, some of them I'm not really comfortable sharing because they were very private. Some people you'd meet and right away they would tell you their life story. And you're trying to make small talk. You're walking.
Right.
And there's no other distractions,
Right.
so you're making conversations. And some of these stories, some of them were, I'm on college break and I'm just, I'm doing a walk and this seemed like a great thing and I'm a hiker and these are the kinds of things I appeal to. Other people were working through some pretty serious issues in their lives. And so, we kept saying like everyone's got their bag, their physical bag that they carry, then they got the other baggage that they're carrying.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people do the Camino de Santiago to kind of shed, that extra weight that they're carrying, that kind of non-physical weight that they're carrying.
Did you feel that you needed to shed some of your burdens or your own stuff?
Yeah, I did. And then remind me, because I want to go back to one story that I think you'll love, but the one that I wanted to shed was right before I left, a friend asked me, are you doing this as a fundraiser? And I was so busy packing and trying to figure out, how to keep my pack as light as possible. And do I really need to carry a headlamp and et cetera? And I hadn't really even had time to think about it. And then I thought of a local organization, Break the Hold, which many people might be familiar with. And it's a great organization. It does a lot of programming around teen mental wellness and suicide prevention. And this is a very important topic for me because I lost my dad to suicide. And so I wouldn't say necessarily that it was a burden I think about every day, but I think Break the Hold's done a good job, or a great job of getting people to, it's okay to talk about mental health. And, back when my dad took his life, it was not talked about at all, ever. Like it was just, you pretended like it didn't happen. There was a lot of shame involved. And as an adult, I'm like, it had nothing to do with me. Like, why should I be ashamed? And why should I not be able to talk about my dad? I'm getting a little choked up thinking about it. But, it's something that you should be able to talk about. And so right before I left, I said, you know what, this is great. Break the Hold, great organization. I'm walking anyway. I'll start hitting up all my friends for some cash to donate to Break the Hold. And the friends really came through. And not only friends from Pleasantville, but actually people I met on the walk found out about it because I was wearing the wristband and talking about it. And actually people that I walk with has made donations to Break the Hold as well. So
it's amazing how when people might have done this pilgrimage way centuries ago, right? Like that, it's almost monk-like where they were walking to think about their own things, but I'm not sure they necessarily shared things because we didn't share.
No, people were a little bit more stoic back in those days, I think.
But I think that whole piece of sharing and like kind of going through this experience must have been very uplifting for many of the walkers.
Yeah. And that's part of
that connection.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying that it's like hard to explain to someone because unless you've done that and shared that together, and like maybe somebody shared a story with you, and the story I wanted to share with you, there was this guy, a Japanese guy that I was walking with, and he was a student and he was going to school in Switzerland. And so he was in Switzerland, and we were talking about everyone talked about why did you decide to do the Camino and over dinner or whatever, and I said something like, your parents will be so excited, to hear that you did the Camino. And he said, well, I didn't tell them. And I said, you're kidding. Like, and of course, as a parent of 2 boys, I'm like, I want to know where my kids are at all times. And he's like, yeah, I didn't tell them. I said, well, where do they think you are? And he said, well, Switzerland. And I said, okay. So I let that part go. And then I said, well, that's great. I said, well, when you get back, you'll definitely tell them and they'll be so excited. And he said, no, I'm not going to tell them. And of course I'm stunned, and I said, well, why? And he said, because this is just for me.
Oh, that's lovely.
And that was like one of my favorite things that I heard on the Camino.
Yeah,
and
that's lovely.
My friend Hiro, who just had a birthday, a really nice guy. So that one was really moving to me. But like I said, everyone had a story of some kind, and some of them were really heavy, and some of them maybe not so heavy.
So
but that made it even more
I have a question. How
fulfilling.
many people left their cell phones at home.
Okay, none. So everybody wanted to. So we're trying to be Spartan, but everybody had their phone.
Everybody had
But I
their
wouldn't
phone.
say people. The cell service, well, at least for Americans, was very spotty over there. I mean, all the Europeans, of course, had great cell service, but you didn't really use your phone that much. There was no one to call, really. I mean, the only thing you used your phone for really was to take pictures. And maybe find out if we were lost. We would break out the phone to use the GPS to see if we were lost.
Yeah.
I mean, it's other than being in the Meseta, which is the desert. You're usually walking from town to town, so it's not like you're really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, sometimes it felt like that, but you were always within, probably 20 miles of civilization. So it wasn't like you were so far.
So talk to me about the final piece. You're heading into that final mile and getting to Santiago, and I think there's this great photograph of all of you in front of the church.
In front of the church. Yeah, that's right at the end.
Church. And what can you describe that feeling at all?
Yeah. So I actually would start at the morning. So the morning of let me back up even farther than that. The last 100 kilometers, you get a lot of like what I would refer to as day trippers. So we walked all the way from Saint Jean Pied de Port, which is almost 800 kilometers. And in order to get the Compostela, which is the certificate that says that you walked the Camino, you only have to do the last 100 kilometers.
Oh.
So you get a lot of these people who kind of take like a 5-day trip with their Louis Vuitton handbag and suitcase, and they do the last 5 days. So for people who've been walking for, in some cases, a friend walked from Le Puy, you can imagine all of a sudden there's these day trippers and they're really annoying.
Yeah.
Because they're like, they're there at the last minute, like, you weren't there when we were in St. John. So it got very crowded on the Camino. The albergues, or the hostels that we stayed in, became very crowded. It became more of a challenge to find a place to stay. The trails were crowded. You'd get to a place to eat. Everything was crowded. So I would say in the last 4 or 5 days, things kind of sped up. We were just trying to okay, let's just get this over with because it's too crowded now. The more interesting.
Kind of loses that.
It lost some of its appeal in the last few days. It was still great, but it was that there were too many people. And so the morning of, we got up and part of my brain was like, I just want to get this over with and go on my vacation. But at the same time, I didn't want it to end, because I had made these great friends on the trip, who I still keep in touch with, which is great. And so I was kind of conflicted. I wanted it to end, but I also didn't want it to end. And so we got up in the morning, we had breakfast, and the mood was like jubilation. I mean, we were all so excited, but everybody was kind of physically, everyone was really tired from walking. So there was a kind of a combination of factors going on, and it was very serene, I would describe it. We walked in, a guy had a ukulele, and we were singing and kind of walking along and filming each other and how excited we were. And we got to a big sign outside of the city, and we posed by the sign, and we knew, this is coming, to the end. At least to Santiago, because some were going on to walk all the way to the water, which is another 3-day walk, but a lot were stopping in Santiago. But just an exciting feeling.
After all this, what was your takeaway? How are you going to keep that feeling or that experience that you went through? I mean, you come back now to a place where you have everything, right? And you were walking a walk in such a minimal amount of stuff.
So we actually talked about this on the trip, and you're always looking for these deep discussions, and when you've been walking with someone for 3 or 4 weeks, you really get to know them very well. And so the conversations swerve into these very deep places, which is why you get so connected, I think, to the people that you walk with. And it's just amazing feeling, and we talked about what are you going to take away from this, and I think for a lot of people, and me particularly, mine was, I really don't need that much stuff. I have, I live in Westchester, I have a nice house, I have a lot of stuff, and the reality was everything I needed was in that pack. All I needed was 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, some toiletries, a hat, some sunscreen. That's really about it.
That's it.
I really didn't need all this other stuff. And so that feeling that when you got back, it was, like I said, this feeling of serenity and very relaxed and just feeling really good about everything. And then of course, life starts, trying to intrude on you when you get back. There's bills to pay, there's things that need to get taken care of. And I've even talked to people since, who I walked with since getting back. It's there's all this stuff coming at me. And it's the Camino is something that's inside you after you do it. So you can always carry it with you. Sometimes you need to remind yourself, I think. Certainly it's like anything when you come back from vacation, and the day back, and you're like, oh, I feel great. And then 2 days later, oh, it's all gone.
And as the coach for cross country and track, you're
Sure.
probably now very busy.
I am very busy. Yeah, we have a lot of kids on the team. I have like 50 kids on the team on cross country,
Yeah.
so I'm very busy with that and planning all their activities and
Yeah.
getting them ready for meets and so forth.
So you need to kind of go back to that space that you were in,
Right.
and
Yeah.
center yourself
Yeah.
again.
Yeah, it's a
you
very
have-
spiritual thing, I
Yeah.
think. And I think, like I said, like a lot of people, we talked about this on the trip and what they took away from it. And it was like, how do you take this feeling and then always have it?
Have it.
And so what most people, and and my friends who hear this are going to laugh, because while I was walking, I'm never doing this again. You know, it was so difficult. And I know we were joking earlier, like childbirth, you know, now I'm like, well, I can maybe do it again.
And
there's
do a different path.
Yeah, maybe do a
right?
different path, like maybe do the Portuguese, which is a shorter trip. It only takes about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
30 days or more is definitely a big undertaking,
Yeah,
but certainly
there are shorter ones.
there are shorter ones, and some people actually don't walk the entire Camino in one shot. They
Right.
go back, and actually I walked with a guy from Ireland. He did it over a few years. He would do one section, and then he'd go home, and then he'd come back and do another section. And as long as you do the entire thing,
Yeah.
and you actually carry a little paper passport with you that's stamped at all the places you stay. As long as you show that passport that you went through all of the towns, you'll still get your Compostela showing that you
So
completed.
if somebody was interested in doing this, you know, what would you tell them? Like, what did you learn that maybe you would have done differently?
Oh, so much. So many things differently. So I would have lost the weight before I went on the trip. That would have been, I mean, I definitely dropped, I mean, it was very, very hot in Spain. It got to like
How
100.
much weight did you lose?
I lost like 15 pounds.
Oh my God.
So it got up in 33 days. So it got up to about 109 degrees. So it was very, very hot. But the temperature swings would be from like 50s, low 50s in the morning to well over 100 in the afternoon.
Wow.
So huge temperature swings.
Yeah, it was a bad summer.
And it was
in
very,
Europe.
very hot in
Yeah.
Spain. Of course, we're in Spain. We're looking at the weather report, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of red. You know, and it was like actually a heat warning
Yeah.
even for Spain, and it's already hot in Spain, but they were giving a heat warning. So things I would have done a little bit more physical preparation, more hiking, more in advance.
Okay.
The biggest thing I would have done is I would have reduced the size of my pack. My pack was too big. On the forum that I went to, they were like, oh yeah, 38 liters is great. And then I had a couple friends walking with like 25 or less packs, and like I would have gone that small. Like really, as I said, you don't really need that much.
Right.
I would have shed I threw some of the stuff away that I was carrying because it was just, you don't want to carry
Too
something.
much.
It's just too much, you don't need it. So, of course my planning brain was, oh, you're gonna need it and you should keep it. And I just had too much stuff. So I ended up throwing stuff away or donate. There was a donation bin where you could put things just to get rid of them.
That's great.
So smaller pack, more physical preparation.
Yeah.
That's probably about it. The rest of it,
Great.
the thing about the Camino that I think really appeals to people is the kind of free-spiritedness, if that's a word, of like not knowing where you're going to stay that night, of, I was going to stay here, but you know what, it's too far, I'm going to stay here today, or I feel good today, so I'm going to walk,
Yeah.
an extra 10 or 15 kilometers, so
Yeah.
I'm feeling great. And I did that on the trip. And I think, from our perspective of like, you're always planning your life to the nth degree and everything's on a calendar, that kind of freedom from, you know what, I'm making a command decision here, I'm going to do things a little bit differently today
Yeah.
or over the next couple of days. That's incredibly liberating, and I think that's what really appeals
Yeah.
to people on this.
Well, Tim, thank you so much.
You're
This
welcome.
was so interesting, and it is an inspiration. And if people have questions, can they email you?
Sure, of course.
Okay, so your email is
durgans@gmail.com. Sure.
And we do have some resources for people to look at. That article I thought was really
Definitely read that article.
very interesting.
People read that article, I think will immediately book a trip to Europe to start walking.
And your photos were beautiful, beautiful, beautiful photos. So
Thank you.
thank you again, and we
My
look
pleasure.
forward to hearing your next trip when you do this again.
Okay, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.